the final year students of Ghana Christian International High School (PAC). I would encourage you guys to watch our videos, like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel Watson TV. Thank you all. Bye.
Hello there. I welcome you once again to our virtual Wasi History TV. In our previous video, which I have added the link, shared the link under the description, so you can go and check. We looked at oral tradition as a source for studying African history. We did look at the definition for oral tradition. We also looked at the forms of oral tradition, and we also looked at some of the examples of the forms of oral traditions that we learned about. And I am very hopeful that you have not forgotten about that. In case you have not also watched that video, there is a link to the description. Before you can understand this particular topic, you need to actually visit that video about oral tradition before you can be able to grab or understand perfectly what this topic is about. So today we are looking at the advantages of oral tradition as a source for studying African history. So what are some of the important advantages, the merits, the strength of using oral tradition to study African history? And then we will also look at the disadvantages of using oral tradition as a source for the reconstruction of African history. So let's begin with our discussion. Begin with our discussion first. Good. So let's see our lesson objectives for today. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to discuss the advantages or the merits of using oral tradition as a source for reconstruction African history, or for writing or for studying African history. All right, and then also discuss the disadvantages or the demerit in using oral tradition to once again to reconstruct, to write, or to study African history. So let's go into the first one. So one of the advantages of oral tradition as a source for studying African history is that oral tradition is easily accessible. Okay, it's easily accessible. Now, oral tradition is easily accessible in gathering information for African history because in every town, or every town, village, or community in Africa, right, you can find an elder or some elders or some elderly person who is ready to actually give you the history or the traditions or the historical events in that area. You understand? Yes, in that area. Okay, because when you want to use oral tradition to reconstruct African history, we are saying that it is very, very, one advantage is that it is easily accessible, because you can find people, elderly people in every community. So if you want to find an information about town A, if you go to that town A, you can get a lot of people who can actually tell you something about the town. And so using oral tradition to study African history becomes very easy and very accessible. The historian, in one way or the other, only need to contact the knowledgeable informants and respondents for the necessary information that he or she need. And so you just don't contact anybody, even though even though it is accessible. You don't contact any ordinary person. Instead, you contact people who are knowledgeable about the information about the information that you so want to get. All right, and so that is what it means. Very, very accessible. Unlike archaeology, whereby you need to find oral tradition you need to have an information about a site before you go. This one is very, very accessible. Another important or merit or advantage of oral tradition is that it is the main source of history. Oral tradition, if you look at all the, even both the documentary and non-documentary, all the sources of African history, I think oral tradition is more or less the mother of all the other sources that we have looked at. Without oral tradition, all the other sources are invalid. They can't work on their own. All the other sources of non-documentary sources of history depend on what? Oral tradition. So oral tradition then becomes the main or the sole sources of writing African history. Right? In a situation where there are no written records or other piece of information like personal diaries, all right, minutes of meetings, journals, the historian often will rely to a large extent on the information provided by oral tradition to compile what his findings. Even before an archaeologist would go and excavate a site, archaeologists need oral tradition. So, in the absence of all these, oral tradition can still work and perform and give you some sort of what information. Okay, so oral tradition is the main source of African history, and therefore it becomes an advantage whereby the other sources, because they will depend on oral tradition, it becomes a disadvantage for them. All right, but oral tradition becomes the main source for the reconstruction of African history, which is very, 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 very good. Let's look at the next one. Now, oral tradition also helps other sources. Yes, oral tradition helps other sources to confirm historical facts. For example, if it helps the archaeologists, okay, to confirm their findings, that's throwing more light on the findings of the history of a place. So no matter what, oral tradition, beside it being the main source of African history, it also helps other sources. For instance, if an archaeologist goes to excavate and find an artifact, don't forget that sometimes the deductions, we said archaeology could be a guesswork, which becomes a disadvantage. Sometimes their guess could not be true. They will need an oral tradition from the group of people, the descendants of those group of people who own that artifact, okay, so that they can actually confirm from them what that artifact means. Again, the archaeologists would have to be directed by a story from the local people, okay, a story from the local people before he goes to excavate the site. Therefore, without oral tradition, the archaeologist's work becomes difficult. So oral tradition helps archaeology in so many ways. One, it confirms, the artifact found, by the archaeologist. Again, it also gives the archaeologist an information as to which site to go and excavate. So oral tradition helps other sources, not only archaeologists, the other sources that we may look at: numismatics, serology, ethnobotany, ethnography, all the other non-documentary sources that we mention. Oral tradition helps all of them. Again, oral tradition helps interpretation of archaeological findings. Okay, so it helps in the interpretation of archaeological data that are dug from the soil. This is necessary because the artifacts found are both anonymous and fragmentary. Okay, because some of the artifacts that they found, some of them had been under the soil for decades, and so you can't get any meaningful thing from them. For instance, if an archaeologist unearths a human skeleton or comes across a human skeleton with lost limbs, the limbs are lost, apparently severed by sharp object material, they may deduce that the excavated site was a mass grave where people who died after an armed conflict were buried. They may not conclude that, but rather validate their evidence by embarking upon personal inquiry, interviewing, targeting groups in the area. And so, like I said, anything that archaeologists come to discover or finds out, very often they need oral tradition to confirm, what actually had transpired, in time past, before they can be able to come to a reliable conclusion. Other than that, then archaeology, as we have already indicated, becomes a guesswork, which is not good. So it helps in the interpretation of archaeological findings, right? Yes. So let's assume your school. I mean, for instance, where you go to school, let's assume that some 100 years to come, the school is no more. The whole place is taken over by a bush. Now, oral traditions, if archaeologists finds out that there was a school there, they'll go and find out, excavate, comes across certain school materials that could give them an indication that, of course, there was a school there. So it helps archaeology in their findings, interpretation. Again, the last one, advantage of oral tradition is that oral tradition is less expensive, unlike archaeologists, which is very, very, very expensive because of the carbon 14 dating, because of the other things needed. Oral tradition is less expensive, and it provides the easiest and less expensive way of writing history. All what the researcher or the historian needs to do is to go directly to the people, okay, from whom you could obtain a lot of relevant information from at a single visit, without having to go to the library, unlike the documentary source, go to the library, pile out, look for books. Here, the archaeologist just go to the people and he gets a lot of information from them. Well, let's look at the next. Now let's come to the disadvantages or the demerits of oral tradition. I hope you are cool with the advantages. Well, one demerits or disadvantage or limitations of oral tradition is that it may not be precise in detail. Okay, it may not be precise in detail. The narrator may give information in a long, clumsy way, of course, clumsy way, without any specific point. Important aspect of event and their sequence are forgotten as the informant advance in age. Oral traditions are normally told by older people. All right, excuse me. They are normally told by older people. And therefore, what happens is that, as people grow with age, they tend to forget so many information. So if you're not careful, the vital information may not be presented to you. I remember when I was doing my long essay, of course, topic on the history of a certain town in the Adansi region, Adansi Brofiodu. When you talk to the older men, you tend to get a whole lot of information that you yourself you don't even require, and at times they lack the sequence of event. You ask them of the date, they don't know. They don't know when did this happen or that happened, and so that becomes a disadvantage, because you need to be precise in history, and we deal with the sequences of events are very, very also important. The next one is that it may contain exaggerations. Our tradition is full of exaggeration, bias, and prejudices. Okay, the narrator might add irrelevant information or leave out information which may not suit him or her, and this is what we discussed the last time, that was a bad history. Okay, because sometimes they may exaggerate, of course, certain things just to make one ethnic group feel bigger than the other. Meanwhile, it is not so. All right, and sometimes the narrator may be biased. Like I gave you an example that no opposition party will write a good achievement of the government in power, especially in Africa. It doesn't happen. You realize that the opposition will only stress on the evil or the bad things that the government in power has done, and so it may contain biases. And these are the things that we should be careful when we are using oral tradition to reconstruct African history. The next one is that oral tradition may contain inaccurate figures, especially the dates. Sometimes, these older men or people, they are not able to keep dates, so it may be inaccurate. The narrator might forget some part of the event or important dates. Like I said, I asked of the date. We were actually talking about one of the chiefs, and I asked him of the day that, of course, the chief was installed or even ruled. He couldn't say it, and had to go to the archives to actually get an information about about that king. And so that's what oral tradition does. Let's look at more. The last one, I think, the death of informants. Oral tradition can also shortfall in the sense that death or calamity could affect people, and that can result in the loss of important information. You remember we said that one of the disadvantages of the documentary sources was that they could be destroyed by flood and rodent and other things like that. And our traditions too is the same. The informant, the person who is knowledgeable about the history of those people, could actually die. And very often, when he is dead, if it happens that he's the only one who is knowledgeable in the history of the people, what then happens is that the people find it very difficult to actually have their history. So since only the living can tell it and not the dead, yeah. So very often when the person who is knowledgeable dies, it becomes a big problem for the people, and you go there and they won't give you anything. Good. So I think we have done our best. Oscar, I think we have another one. Oral tradition information will be difficult to also cross-check, unlike the documentary source where you can cross-check from other sources to find out the validity of the information. Here, you realize that the cross-checking becomes very difficult, because who are you going to ask? Who are you going to ask to cross-check? You get a point? Because the narrator is the only source of the information. And very often oral tradition to people, a lot of people have different versions of it. So where are you going to cross check that what this lady or woman is saying is true? So that also becomes a problem. Good. So we'll bring our discussion to an end today. We've had a fruitful discussion. Try your hands on these questions, and let's meet some other time. Have a nice day. Bye bye. We shall meet some other time. All right. Okay.
CHTV, first of all, equal.